people didn't put a lot of stock in ghost stories. They were beyond that. But they knew, and this is something that we know today, that sometimes people who are superstitious will come up with a supernatural explanation for having information that has come to them in quite conventional ways. So they thought that this should be investigated. No harm in excavating the cellar hole. They did, and they found nothing. But then the rumor mill had really gotten into full gear, and somebody remembered that the Bourne family farm had burned down shortly after Russell disappeared, and they got the idea that maybe that had something to do with the disappearance. So they excavated the area where the barn had been, and again, they found nothing. But a few days after that, a young boy was walking his dog along the Battenkill River, which abutted the farm, and the dog suddenly bolted, and it ran over to a hollow stump and started digging furiously, and it unearthed some rather large bones. There were 3 physicians in Manchester. They all looked at these bones, and they found that these were human remains, and everybody now knew these must be the remains of Russell Colvin. Now, these 2 Bourne brothers, who everybody had suspected, one of them had moved off to a town called Denmark, New York, but the other was still there. So they took him in for interrogation, and they put him in jail. And there he encountered a man named Silas Merrill. Silas Merrill, not to be confused with Silas Warner, for you English majors, became the first jailhouse snitch in American history. Silas Warner contacted the prosecution and told them that Stephen Bourne, with whom he had been incarcerated, had confessed to the crime. I'm sorry, Jesse Bourne had confessed to the crime. Stephen was the one who moved to Denmark. And he tied the story up very neatly. Indeed, they had killed him, and they put him in the old cellar hole, but they got concerned that the remains were going to be discovered there, so they moved him to the barn, and they got worried that they were going to be discovered there as well. So they moved him again, and just to cover up the evidence, they torched the barn. And where did they put the bones? Right in that stump where the dog had dug them up. And this is the confession that Silas Merrill, related to the authorities in Manchester, Vermont in 1819. Now, with that, of course, in gratitude for this important information, the authorities let Silas out. He was free to do whatever he wanted to do. And who knows what he may have done. But they indicted Jesse for the crime, and they set off to get Stephen in Denmark, who swore that he was going to come back and clear his name, and he did. He came back voluntarily, and he was put into jail. In the meantime, one of the physicians who had opined that these bones were human remains had second thoughts. So he took the bones to a doctor in a nearby town who had a human skeleton, and he compared some of these bones, and he concluded he was wrong. These were animal bones. By now, unfortunately, the authorities already had a confession. So they continued to pursue the case. They didn't disclose any of this. The other doctors were somewhat reluctant, but finally concurred that they had all been wrong. And so they had no physical evidence now that a crime had ever occurred. That was really no problem as far as anybody in Manchester, Vermont was concerned, and they were proceeding with this investigation. Now, Stephen is now put into jail, and he's interrogated by various members of what's called a court of inquiry that's been convened to look into this case. Finally, he confesses, and he tells the same story, except that he basically says it was self-defense. He's trying to portray himself in a way that is not as culpable, and that he might get off with a sentence of less than death. They get the confession. So they go to trial without ever disclosing the physicians that concluded that these were not human remains. Now, nobody lied in the courtroom about saying that they were human remains. That didn't happen. And maybe you've heard of the doctrine of corpus delicti. Anybody know what corpus delicti means? That means the body of the crime. You must prove that a crime was committed. In those days, the confession was considered prima facie evidence of corpus delicti. Not today, primarily as a result of this very case. At any rate, both Warren brothers are convicted by a jury and a three-judge court, the Vermont Supreme Court, and they are both sentenced to death. Now, because the trial was conducted before the Supreme Court, there was no place to appeal. There was not believed to be any federal interest in death penalty cases in those days. But you could apply for clemency to the Vermont legislature, which was a unicameral body like we have in Nebraska today. Fortunately for the Bournes, the legislature was not in session and would not be in session for 18 months, so that prolonged the situation for a while. Ultimately, the legislature convened, they heard these cases, and they decided to commute the sentence of Jesse Bourne to life without hard labor, but they would go ahead and execute Stephen Bourne, the more culpable of the two, under the theory of the crime that the prosecution had advanced. Now, they took this so seriously in those days that the governor of the state personally went to the prison to tell Stephen Bourne what this decision was. Now, as you might imagine, he was quite unstrung, but he gained his composure after a while, and he proposed to his lawyers that, hey, we don't even know if Russell's dead. So why don't we put an ad in the newspaper for information, asking for people, anybody who has information about Russell Colvin to come forward. And he put an ad in the Rutland Herald, which was the largest newspaper in the area, and it said, that they were looking for evidence of Russell Colvin. Well, the ad didn't really produce anything. But somebody who knew something about this case but got a lot of the facts wrong wrote a letter to the Albany Herald in New York and marveled that if you do something evil in life, you will not get away with it because there are supernatural forces that will make sure that you pay the penalty. Now, so this letter appears in the Albany Herald, and it mentions the Bournes, and it also mentions the name Russell Colvin. And it's reprinted, and this happened a lot in those days. They didn't have wires, the telegraph hadn't been invented yet. They didn't have, but newspapers were basically carried on horseback from one town to another, and people would, one newspaper would reprint stories from another newspaper, and that was quite common in the early 1800s in the United States. So this letter was reprinted in a newspaper called the New York Post. Nothing like the New York Post of today, I might quickly add. But, and it was read aloud in the lobby of a hotel, where there happened to be a visitor from out of town, and he said, gee, I know a man named Russell Colvin. He showed up about 7 years ago, it's now 1819, 12 years after his visit, on my brother's farm, and he talked about Vermont, and I think he mentioned the name Bourne, and you know what, I think it's the same guy. So a group of people set out from this hotel to go find Russell, and indeed they found Russell alive and well and living in New Jersey. So this was the first documented wrongful conviction in an American murder case. It happened in 1819 in Manchester, Vermont. No question they are innocent. We didn't have DNA, but we had something a lot better. We had the corpse showing up alive. Now, a man named, a distinguished professor at Yale, Edwin Brochard, who had been the Librarian of Congress, wrote about this case, and he got some of the facts wrong. And the headline in his book, Convicting the Innocent, when he described this case was, "The corpse answers an advertisement." Now, it wasn't true, that he hadn't come forward as a result, and he hadn't answered anything, he'd been found, and it wasn't as a result of the advertisement, it was a result of the letter that had appeared in the Albany Herald and was reprinted in the New York Post. But this story has appeared from time to time in the literature, in legal literature, and the fallacious information that Edwin Brochard came up with has been given, now passed on as fact, but it's not fact. So that shows you what some of the problems of journalism are. Now, in the years since the exoneration of the Colvin brothers, there have been 243 documented exonerations in American capital cases. One of them is Randy's. And right here are a couple, that man 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from the corner, that's Ray Crone. He was in Arizona, he's a very good friend of mine. Ronald Jones, a client of Jan Sussler from the People's Law Office, who was here, and Vernil Jimerson. These were defendants in the Fort Heights 4. Dennis Williams, back there, was another defendant in the Fort Heights 4 case. And this was the case that Bethany described that I first wrote about in Chicago Lawyer, when I received a letter from Dennis Williams beseeching us to look into the case. Now, the death penalty had just been restored, so I was very eager to look at this. The conviction they've been charged basically because this woman right here, Paula Gregg, who was 17 years old, had confessed to the police. She said that she had held a big cigarette lighter burning for 5 minutes while the 4 male defendants, providing the only light in an abandoned townhouse, while the 4 male defendants repeatedly raped and sodomized the female victim, killed her, and then shot her fiancé to death. The victims were named Carol Schmall and Larry Weinberg. The story that Paula's confession seemed on the surface to be, pretty good, except of course for this little detail of holding a big. They called it in the state's attorney's office the flick of the big case. But the fact is, you cannot hold a big cigarette lighter for more than about 45 seconds. They're designed, actually, there are safety devices, but what happens is they will just fly apart and go out after, at most. And ultimately, we had lighters tested by forensic scientists and found that they all